For over 1,000 years, Europe was stuck. No science, no art, no progress. People lived and died the same way, generation after generation. Then, in just 100 years, everything exploded. Art, science, exploration, medicine, all of it transformed. This is the story of the most important century in Western history, and most people have never heard of it. From the ashes of plague, famine, and war, a new world was rising. Humanity was about to be reborn. In the workshops of Florence, artists and scholars were daring to see the world with fresh, unflinching eyes. The long medieval darkness was finally lifting. Across Europe, humanity reached for something it had long forgotten. Domes rose over Florence. Armies marched across continents. Ships sailed beyond the edge of every known map. Europe in 1401 was still a graveyard. The Black Death had killed nearly half of its entire population. A hand begins to sketch what the eye truly observes. Art and science were becoming one and the same. The old maps were filled with sea monsters and legends. The new ones would be filled with coastlines and truth. Portuguese caravels pushed south into waters no European had ever sailed. The great age of discovery was calling them forward. Across the entire globe, civilizations were transforming at the same moment. This was never just one story, it was dozens. In a cramped German workshop, a goldsmith named Gutenberg examined tiny metal letters. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. In Florentine workshops, masters taught apprentices the old techniques alongside revolutionary new ideas. Genius was being deliberately cultivated. In 1401, Ming China was the largest and most powerful empire on earth. Europe was a fragmented, recovering afterthought. Beijing was being rebuilt as the magnificent capital of the world's mightiest empire. Nothing in Europe could even begin to compare. Timur the Destroyer was dead by 1405. His vast empire shattered overnight into warring, jealous fragments. Europe's plague survivors inherited a changed world, fewer people, more land, higher wages, and a desperate new hunger for meaning. Florence, a city of bankers, wool traders, and weavers, was quietly transforming itself into the capital of human genius. Constantinople still stood, but just barely. The once mighty Roman Empire had shrunk to a single city, waiting for the end. The Ottomans have been shattered by Timur and Ankara. But empires driven by destiny do not stay broken for very long. 5 great Italian city-states, 5 bitter rivals. Their relentless competition for glory would accidentally help invent the modern world. Portugal, a tiny, overlooked kingdom clinging to the edge of Europe, was quietly preparing to change absolutely everything. In the hills of Bohemia, a university priest named Jan Hus was asking dangerous questions. The church was growing uneasy. A world recovering from catastrophe. A new century just beginning. No one alive yet understood what extraordinary changes were coming. The sun rose over Florence, painting the Arno River gold. The longest and most glorious dawn in human history was beginning. The young Jianwen emperor sat uneasily on the dragon throne in Nanjing. His powerful uncle Zhu Di watched him and plotted. Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, raised his banners in open rebellion against his own nephew. China was tearing itself apart. The Jingnan campaign was 3 years of savage civil war. Uncle against nephew, army against army, dynasty against itself. Nanjing's imperial palace burned to the ground. The Jianwen emperor vanished forever. His body was never found. History's greatest mystery. In 1402, the usurper Zhu Di crowned himself the Yongle emperor. He would become the greatest ruler Ming China ever produced. Yongle dreamed of an entirely new capital far to the north, Beijing. He would build the greatest palace complex the world had ever seen. 100,000 laborers. 14 years of relentless construction. The Forbidden City, the largest palace on earth, began to rise. 9,900 rooms. This was imperial power made breathtakingly visible. Yongle ordered every piece of Chinese knowledge compiled into a single work. 11,000 handwritten volumes. The largest encyclopedia in all of history. Yongle's armies marched deep into Mongolia and conquered Vietnam. Under his iron rule, the Ming Empire reached its absolute maximum extent. Zheng He, a captured Muslim boy from Yunnan. Castrated and enslaved, rose to become the greatest admiral the world had ever known. 300 ships, 28,000 sailors and soldiers. In 1405, the greatest fleet in human history set sail from China. Zheng He's treasure ships were over 400 feet long. Christopher Columbus's entire fleet could have fit comfortably on a single deck. The treasure fleet departed China's southern coast like a floating city of wood and silk. Nothing like it had ever existed before. Southeast Asian kingdoms watched in stunned awe as hundreds of Chinese ships appeared like a forest of masts on their horizons. Indian port cities welcomed the treasure fleet with open arms. Chinese silk and porcelain were exchanged for precious spices and glittering gems. Chinese treasure ships reached the Persian Gulf and the coasts of Arabia. East met west, but entirely on China's own terms. The fleet sailed all the way to East Africa. Chinese sailors walked the ancient streets of Mogadishu, Malindi, and Mombasa. A living giraffe arrived at the Ming imperial court. The amazed Chinese called it a kilin, a mythical sign of heaven's divine blessing. 7 epic voyages spanning nearly 30 years. Zheng He connected half the known world before Europe had even begun to try. When the Yongle Emperor died in 1424, the political will behind China's great age of exploration began rapidly fading away. In 1433, the great Admiral Zheng He died at sea during his 7th and final voyage. The treasure fleets sailed home forever. Confucian court officials burned the navigation records and ordered the great ships destroyed. China deliberately chose to forget its own greatest achievement. The mightiest naval power the world had ever seen simply turned its back on the ocean. All of history turned on that single decision. 3 different men simultaneously claimed to be the one true Pope. The church meant to save souls could not even save itself. Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund demanded an ecumenical council. All of Western Christendom would gather in one place to finally end the chaos. Constance, southern Germany, 1414. Over 70,000 people descended on a small lakeside town to repair the broken Catholic Church. 3 rival popes, Gregory, Benedict, and John, were all summoned and told to resign. The age of papal arrogance was meeting accountability. Pope John XXIII panicked and fled the council disguised as a stable groom on a borrowed horse. He was captured and thrown in prison. Finally, one church, one pope, Martin V was elected in 1417. After 40 agonizing years, the Western Schism was over. The Czech reformer Jan Hus traveled to Constance carrying a solemn imperial promise of safe conduct. That sacred promise would be deliberately broken. The council demanded that Hus publicly recant every word he had written and preached. He looked them in the eye and quietly refused. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was burned alive at the stake. He sang hymns until the smoke finally stole his voice. When the people of Bohemia learned what the church had done to their beloved preacher, an entire nation erupted in righteous, unstoppable fury. Prague, 1419. An angry mob stormed the town hall and hurled Catholic councillors from the upper windows to their deaths below. Peasants, craftsmen, miners, and village priests took up whatever weapons they had. This was not a nobleman's war, this was the people's war. Jan Zika, a weathered old soldier, blind in one eye and later completely blind, became the most feared military commander in all of Europe. Farm wagons reinforced with heavy wooden planks, chained together into mobile fortresses. Simple, brilliant, and absolutely devastating against mounted knights. The Pope proclaimed a holy crusade against the Hussite heretics. Thousands of German knights rode confidently into Bohemia, expecting easy slaughter of peasants. Armored crusader knights charged headlong into the wagon fortresses and were cut to pieces. The survivors fled Bohemia in stunned, humiliated disbelief. 4 separate crusades were launched against the Hussites. 4 times, the greatest armies in Europe were defeated and sent running by common people. Jan Zika died in 1424, undefeated in battle. According to legend, his soldiers made a war drum from his own skin. The Hussites didn't just defend their homeland, they went on the offensive, raiding deep into Germany, Austria, and Hungary at terrifying will. A full century before Martin Luther, the Hussites demanded church reform, communion in both kinds, and scripture in their own language. They were the Reformation's rehearsal. In 1436, the exhausted church agreed to a compromise at Basel. Bohemia kept its distinct faith, but the church itself learned absolutely nothing. Henry V was crowned King of England in 1413. He was young, ruthless, charismatic, and completely obsessed with conquering France. In August of 1415, Henry crossed the English Channel with 12,000 men and a burning claim to the throne of France. The port fortress of Harfleur finally fell, but dysentery ravaged Henry's army. He had won one city but lost nearly half his fighting men. Henry marched his sick, starving army toward Calais. A French force 5 times his size blocked every road ahead. There was absolutely no escape. October the 25th, 1415, the Feast of St. Crispin. A muddy farmer's field in northern France was about to become immortal. Heavy autumn rains had turned the narrow battlefield into a swamp. For thousands of heavily armored French knights, that mud would become their grave. English longbows darkened the sky like a plague of wooden locusts. French knights sank knee-deep in mud and were slaughtered where they stood. By nightfall, over 10,000 Frenchmen lay dead, an entire generation of French nobility destroyed in a single catastrophic afternoon of blood and mud. Henry V walked off that muddy field as the most legendary warrior king in English history. Agincourt made him immortal. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 declared Henry V heir to the French crown. An English king would rule both great kingdoms. Then, at just 35 years old, Henry died of dysentery in France. His 9-month-old infant son inherited 2 kingdoms and would eventually lose them both. In a tiny village called Domremy, a 13-year-old peasant girl began hearing the voices of saints commanding her to rescue the kingdom of France. She cut her hair short, dressed herself as a boy, and rode through hundreds of miles of enemy-held territory to find the uncrowned king. Joan walked into a crowded hall at Chinon, ignored every nobleman present, and went straight to the disguised dauphin. France had found its impossible miracle. They gave a 17-year-old peasant girl a suit of white armor and command of a royal army. Nothing about it made any sense, and yet it worked. The great city of Orleans was starving behind its walls. English siege cannons pounded day and night. If Orleans fell, France itself would die with it. Joan arrived at Orleans like a holy storm. She led charges from the front, took an arrow to the shoulder, and broke the English siege in just 9 days. Orleans was free. Church bells rang across southern France. The people whispered a single, astonished word, miracle. The maid had delivered them. Joan marched the timid dauphin straight through enemy-held territory all the way to Reims, the sacred city where every true French king must be crowned. Charles VII was anointed with the holy oil of Clovis in Reims Cathedral. Joan of Arc stood at his side with tears streaming down her face. But Joan refused to stop fighting. She pushed on toward Paris, and the miraculous fortune that had always protected her began, slowly and cruelly, to turn. Joan was captured in a skirmish at Compiègne and sold to the English for 10,000 gold livres. The king she had crowned did absolutely nothing to save her. They put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft in an English puppet court. She was only 19, and she answered every trick question with astonishing courage. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they burned Joan of Arc alive in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. She had changed the world. France would eventually win the 100 Years' War. The English would be driven from the continent. Joan's sacrifice lit a sacred fire that never ever died. After a devastating civil war between his sons, Mehmed I carefully stitched the shattered Ottoman Empire back together. The recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Murad II seized power in 1421. Under his steady, ambitious rule, the Ottoman war machine roared back to terrifying life. In 1422, Ottoman siege cannons fired on the ancient triple walls of Constantinople for the first time. The city survived, but only barely. It was a clear warning. The great Greek city of Thessalonica fell to Ottoman assault in 1430. Thousands of its citizens were enslaved. Constantinople now stood completely and utterly alone. Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, one by one, the Christian Balkans fell under the growing Ottoman shadow. Christian Europe assembled one last desperate crusade. Hungarians and Poles marched south to stop the Ottoman tide. At Varna in 1444, young King Władysław charged the Ottoman center. It was his final act on earth. The king's severed head was mounted on a spear. The last crusade had failed. The Ottomans were now unstoppable. In 1401, Florence held a competition for bronze baptistry doors. 2 geniuses entered. The Renaissance began. Ghiberti won the doors. Brunelleschi lost, and in his fury, reinvented the entire science of architecture. Brunelleschi spent years in Rome measuring ancient ruins. He was reverse engineering a civilization dead for 1,000 years. Florence's cathedral had a massive hole no living architect could cover. Brunelleschi alone believed he could do it. No scaffolding, no centering frame. He invented new construction techniques as he went, solving impossible problems in real time. The dome rose over Florence like a second sun. It remains the largest masonry dome ever built by human hands. Masaccio painted with perspective, shadow, and real human emotion. In one short lifetime, he transformed painting forever. Donatello's bronze David stood naked and triumphant, the first freestanding nude sculpture in over 1,000 years. The Medici had enormous banking wealth. What made them immortal was how they chose to spend it, on genius. Cosimo de' Medici took control of Florence in 1434. Democracy ended, the Golden Age began. Portuguese caravels crept down Africa's coast. In 1434, they passed Cape Bajador, the point of no return. Madeira and the Azores were claimed for Portugal. A global empire was being born, one small island at a time. The African coast revealed gold dust and enslaved humans. Exploration brought both astonishing discovery and unspeakable horror. In Mainz, a goldsmith named Gutenberg was perfecting movable metal type. The information revolution was almost here. Korea's Kim Sejong created Hangul, a perfect alphabet designed so any common person could learn to read. In Mexico, the Aztec Triple Alliance was building an empire of tribute, sacrifice, and breathtaking artistic beauty. In the Andes, Pachacuri was building the Inca Empire, the largest civilization the Americas had ever known. By 1450, the medieval world was dying. Something new, curious, ambitious, and deeply dangerous was being born.
Next, the 15th century, Part 2, the fall of Constantinople.